Three African nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, have just made a bold move that caught the world off guard. No loans from the IMF, no approval from France, no support from the World Bank, no flashy headlines. And yet, what they did has the potential to shake the foundations of the global financial order. They built a regional development bank, fully African, fully sovereign, and fully independent from any foreign power. The institution is called the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development. At first glance, it might sound like just another bureaucratic body, but make no mistake, this is far more than a bank. It's a declaration of autonomy, a powerful counterattack against international institutions that have long dictated the terms of development in Africa. A new gateway toward economic self-determination, regional infrastructure, and a reshaping of African political thought. What's most striking is the deafening silence from the West. No major headlines, no expert panels, no breaking news. And that silence speaks volumes. Because when countries long dismissed as unstable or underdeveloped start building their own future without asking for permission, without asking for money, it's not just an economic story, it's a revolution. So now the real question emerges, why is the world so quiet about this? And if this is only the beginning, what happens when more African nations decide to take the same path? To understand why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger created their own bank, you have to look beyond the headlines and into the pressure cooker of recent African history. These three nations sit at the heart of the Sahel, a region often described in international media as poor, fragile, or crisis-prone. But this narrative, shaped for decades by outsiders, ignores the deeper story. These countries were being squeezed by a global system designed to keep them in place. Over the past few years, all three nations experienced military coups that toppled governments aligned with Western agendas. The response from the international community was swift and punishing: economic sanctions, suspended aid, and diplomatic isolation. Western troops withdrew. World Bank funds stopped flowing. The message was clear: if you step out of line, you will be cut off. But here's the twist. These countries didn't fold under pressure. They didn't beg to be let back in. They didn't plead for reform packages. Instead, they turned inward toward each other and began to rewrite the rules of engagement. What united them wasn't just geography, but frustration. Years of development assistance had delivered few tangible results. Roads that led to nowhere, schools without teachers, airports that never opened. Aid always came with conditions: change your laws, follow our models, hire our consultants. What was branded as support often turned out to be subtle control. At some point, that frustration crystallized into clarity. These governments, now led by military-backed regimes, realized they were no longer interested in playing a rigged game. And more importantly, they discovered they weren't alone. All three had the same experience, the same grievances, and now the same vision: build a system for themselves, by themselves. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, in 2023 marked the first real step. It was dismissed by many global observers as a desperate move by isolated regimes. But now, with the Confederate Bank at its center, the alliance is beginning to look less like a reaction and more like a blueprint. This context matters because it explains the why behind the bank. It wasn't born from ambition or ideology. It was born from exhaustion, the exhaustion of asking, waiting, and obeying with so little to show for it. And now that patience has run out. The creation of the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development wasn't a press stunt, a temporary reaction, or a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated, deeply strategic decision, one that signals the beginning of a new economic era for the Sahel. What makes it even more remarkable is how it came together quietly, without foreign funding, without international approval, and without a single glossy ribbon-cutting ceremony. Let's break it down. This bank was launched by three of the most economically marginalized and politically isolated countries in West Africa. And yet it began operations with 500 billion CFA francs in initial capital, roughly $820 to $833 million USD. That number is not just impressive, it's historic. Especially because not a cent of it came from the World Bank, IMF, or Western lenders. The funding came from within, from regional reserve state budgets and networks across the Sahel that pooled their own financial strength. But this isn't just about money. It's about independence, real, tangible, functional independence. The Confederate Bank isn't just an alternative lender. It's a rejection of the old system, a refusal to continue dancing to the tune of external donors and economists seated in faraway capitals. For decades, financial support in this region came with long strings attached. Countries were forced to privatize water systems, freeze public wages, or cut food subsidies, not because it was in their interest, but because that's what the loan terms required. Leaders had to seek permission just to invest in their own agriculture infrastructure or healthcare. If the idea didn't fit the reform package, it didn't get funded. Now all of that changes. The Confederate Bank is wholly African-owned and regionally governed. It has a single purpose: to finance the development priorities of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger on their terms. Whether it's building a new road, supporting local food producers, or powering remote communities with solar microgrids, the decision will no longer rest in the hands of distant institutions. This move also has a strategic function. It shields the alliance from external economic pressure. In the past, sanctions or suspended loans could halt national projects overnight. Now, the AES bloc can fund itself and set priorities based on what matters to them, not what pleases foreign partners. Critically, the bank was designed not just to lend, but to lead. It's a tool for policy coordination, regional trade, and long-term investment, a hub that aligns three national agendas into one economic engine. It's not just about avoiding debt. It's about building something permanent and powerful, and that's what makes it revolutionary. For the first time, development in the Sahel won't be dictated from Brussels, Paris, or Washington. It will be authored, funded, and managed from within. The Confederate Bank for Investment and Development isn't just a financial institution, it's a declaration. A message not written in slogans or speeches, but in infrastructure policy and cash flow. It tells the world something African leaders have rarely been able to say with conviction: we've got this, and we don't need your permission. This bank is part of a larger, deliberate unraveling of post-colonial dependence. For decades, countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were tightly bound to the CFA franc, a currency system controlled and guaranteed by the French Treasury. Membership in Western-backed regional bodies like ECOWAS and the West African Economic and Monetary Union, WEMU, further tied them to rules and economic priorities that often didn't align with their own needs. But that era is ending. Since 2023, these nations have exited. ECOWAS expelled foreign troops and redefined their alliances under the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. The Confederate Bank is the financial backbone of this broader transformation. It's not just a tool for funding, it's a symbol of rupture, a statement of sovereignty made visible in brick, steel, and strategic planning. The West's silence on this development speaks volumes. Acknowledging the bank's success would mean admitting that Africa doesn't need to be rescued, it simply needed space to build. And now that space has been claimed. What's most radical is not the amount of capital or the structure of the bank, but the mindset behind it. These leaders are not trying to earn good grades from rating agencies. They're not tailoring reforms to please global lenders. They're building for their people, not for approval, not for applause. And that shift from external validation to internal purpose is seismic. This is not just about controlling interest rates or approving loans. It's about reclaiming dignity, direction, and the right to self-determine. The Confederate Bank doesn't just fund bridges and power plants. It funds a narrative shift, a future where Africa is no longer the recipient of development plans, but the author of its own. The Confederate Bank is not just sitting on its capital, it's already moving money where it matters most. And what sets this institution apart is that its investments are not designed to impress foreign investors or serve export markets. They are built to serve people, to create real, tangible improvements in daily life across the Sahel. 1. Infrastructure that connects, not extracts. For years, the region has been promised infrastructure by international donors. Plans were announced, studies, commissioned, funds pledged, but the roads never came. Or if they did, they were designed to funnel raw materials out, not to connect communities within. The Confederate Bank is flipping that script. Its first flagship project, a regional railway system that links Burkina Faso's logistics centers, Mali's industrial hubs, and Niger's mining zones, especially its uranium fields. But this isn't about exporting to Europe or China. It's about intra-African trade, reducing reliance on middlemen, and allowing goods to move efficiently from farm to factory to market. 2. Energy independence. Through solar microgrids, electricity in the Sahel is unreliable, expensive, and often imported. Blackouts are common. Diesel generators dominate rural areas, but with abundant sunlight and vast, unused land, the region has massive potential for solar energy. Instead of waiting for international developers to finance mega projects, the Confederate Bank is investing in community-owned microgrids, small, decentralized renewable power systems that keep schools running, clinics open, and local businesses thriving. These are not charity projects. They are engines of long-term grassroots development. 3. Agriculture for self-sufficiency, not export. Despite fertile land, many Sahel countries still import basic food staples. Why? Because global aid programs and trade policies made imported rice and wheat cheaper than local crops. African farmers, underfunded and undersupported, were left behind. Now the bank is pouring funds into the entire agricultural supply chain: tractors, irrigation, storage, food processing, and distribution. The goal is clear: grow what you eat what you grow. No more selling fresh tomatoes for pennies and buying back imported tomato paste. The region is reclaiming its agricultural dignity, one cooperative and one crop at a time. 4. Regional airline connecting Africans to each other. For decades, flying from one West African country to another often meant transiting through Paris, a legacy of colonial-era airline networks. Flights were long, expensive, and inaccessible to most. The Confederate Bank is helping to launch a regional airline with direct routes between Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. It's about economic integration, cultural exchange, and mobility without middlemen. No more layovers in Europe just to visit your neighbor. The creation of the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development is not just a financial maneuver. It's a declaration of a new age, an age in which African countries, particularly those long dismissed as weak or unstable, are beginning to reclaim control over their economic destinies. It represents the birth of a new financial frontier where sovereignty, cooperation, and strategic self-reliance replace dependency and externally imposed blueprints. For decades, Africa has existed within a global system not designed to see it thrive, but to ensure it remained integrated on someone else's terms. Loans from the IMF and the World Bank often arrived with hidden price tags: economic restructuring, austerity, privatization. These were the conditions of assistance policies written far from the realities of African villages, farms, and cities. These institutions measured development in terms of GDP growth, credit ratings, and investor confidence, not in terms of sovereignty, dignity, or practical results. But Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, countries often seen as vulnerable, landlocked, and politically isolated, have done something extraordinary. Not only did they refuse to continue playing by these outdated rules, they actually built an alternative. And they didn't build it with noise threats or international grandstanding. They built it through quiet defiance and purposeful strategy. The Confederate Bank is more than a place to store or distribute money. It is the physical embodiment of an idea that development does not need to come with conditions, that nations can fund their own infrastructure, support their own industries, and design their own economies. That Africa, when given space, doesn't just survive, it innovates. This bank is the financial engine of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a regional bloc that emerged from rejection of double standards, rejection of military occupation disguised as peacekeeping, rejection of development frameworks that never delivered. AES wasn't created to oppose integration, it was created to redefine it. And now, with a shared financial institution at its core, that integration is no longer just a policy goal, it's a working reality. Consider what's already changing. With one bank, 3 nations are coordinating infrastructure projects, laying down real railways, investing in solar grids, modernizing food production, and launching a regional airline. These are not dreams, these are live projects not made for export but for internal strength. They're transforming dusty trade routes into economic arteries, turning forgotten towns into logistical hubs and powering rural communities that the old system ignored. And the strategy runs deep. The Confederate Bank is also developing its own digital payment system, allowing cross-border commerce without relying on euros dollars or French-backed CFA francs. It's creating a sovereign financial ecosystem that finally reflects African realities, low fees, wide access, mobile integration, and it's tailored to the needs of people who have too often been left outside the formal economy. Critically, this institution is not a reaction, it's a blueprint, a model other African countries can replicate, customize, or join. What happens when Guinea expresses interest, or when Chad applies for integration? What happens when regional economies like Benin or Togo see real results coming out of AIS? It's no longer unthinkable. This is why the West is so quiet. Because to acknowledge the bank is to acknowledge a dangerous truth that Africa was never incapable. It was just held back. And when left to govern itself, Africa doesn't collapse, it builds. And now it's building fast. The Confederate Bank stands as a symbol of self-respect, of intentional planning, and of long-term unity. It doesn't hand out favors. It doesn't function on handshakes and photo ops. It's not a show. It's a system, a serious one, built for the long haul. And it's important to note that this model is not about shutting out the world. It's about setting terms. If international investors want to participate, they can. But on AES's rules, not Brussels's, not Washington's, not Paris's. The bank is a gatekeeper, a sovereign regulator of access to one of Africa's most strategic blocks. And that alone is a reversal of decades of dependence. Imagine what happens when AES develops its own currency, backed by a bank with credibility, capital, and consistency. Imagine the effect of a common market, regional trade zones, coordinated budgets, and digitally linked economies, all protected by a financial firewall that no foreign power can arbitrarily disrupt. That's not just resilience, that's real geopolitical leverage. And this is the most revolutionary part of all. The people behind the Confederate Bank are not professional revolutionaries. They are economists, engineers, and public servants with practical goals. This is not about ideology, it's about strategy. It's about using limited resources with maximum impact. It's about refusing to waste another generation waiting for outside help that never truly arrives. If this experiment succeeds, the narrative of Africa as a continent in need of saving will no longer hold. And that terrifies those who built careers and profits on the old story. Because the moment Africa no longer needs to ask for permission is the moment it redefines global power altogether. In the end, the Confederate Bank is not a threat to peace or development, it is a threat to control. It challenges the entire architecture of how development has been designed, marketed, and delivered. And it proves that sovereignty, when backed by planning and cooperation, can outpace even the most well-funded foreign aid programs. So as the world watches silently or skeptically, the Sahel moves forward. Not with fanfare, not with applause, but with determination, with unity, with a bank. And that changes everything. The story of the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development, established by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is not just a financial development, it is a profound political, cultural, and strategic lesson in sovereignty, resilience, and redefinition of global order. It serves as a textbook example of how marginalized nations can leverage unity and vision to challenge a deeply entrenched system of dependency while reclaiming agency over their own development. One of the most important lessons from this story is the power of self-determination. For decades, African nations have been perceived through the narrow lens of poverty, instability, and external dependency. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank structured assistance programs with conditions that limited true economic freedom. Projects were often designed to benefit donor countries more than local populations. But by establishing their own bank, these three Sahel countries sent a clear message. The era of waiting for permission is over. They are no longer pleading for assistance or reform. Instead, they are choosing to act independently, cooperatively, and deliberately. This new institution is more than a bank. It is a symbol of refusal to play by rules written in foreign capitals, refusal to be patronized, and refusal to be defined by others' narratives. The fact that the Confederate Bank was formed without Western approval funding or fanfare is part of its strength. It illustrates that true sovereignty is not announced in speeches, but enacted through institutions that serve the people's interests. When development priorities are determined locally, outcomes become more relevant, sustainable, and inclusive. Another critical lesson is the value of regional solidarity. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have each faced international sanctions, media ridicule, and political isolation following their respective military transitions. Yet instead of fragmenting under pressure, they consolidated their efforts. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, was the first step, and the Confederate Bank has now become its financial backbone. This teaches us that shared struggle, when met with collective action, can become a powerful force for innovation and transformation. In today's world, where many countries seek integration into global markets by complying with international norms, the AES model demonstrates an alternative regional integration rooted in shared experience and mutual respect. Instead of exporting raw materials for pennies and importing finished goods at inflated prices, these countries are now designing policies and investing in infrastructure to boost intra-African trade. This not only fosters economic resilience, but builds long-term security through cooperation. The bank's initial investments reveal another important lesson: development must be centered on people, not profits. Too often, projects funded by global institutions are geared toward creating environments attractive to foreign investors, not addressing the daily realities of local populations. By contrast, the Confederate Bank's projects are deliberately focused on roads that connect communities, solar grids that power schools and clinics, and agricultural supply chains that feed local populations. In doing so, this model challenges the traditional definition of success. Development is not simply a matter of GDP growth or foreign investment levels. It is about building systems that meet the needs of citizens and promote dignity. Roads that connect farmers to markets, energy that powers villages, and airlines that unite neighboring capitals matter more than skyscrapers or luxury hotels. The Sahel countries are rewriting what development looks like, based on their own vision of progress. This story also reminds us that silence can be revealing. The Western world's muted reaction to the creation of the Confederate Bank is not accidental. It suggests discomfort, perhaps even fear, at the prospect of African nations successfully operating outside the sphere of Western influence. Acknowledging the bank's legitimacy would mean accepting that Africa does not need to be saved. It just needs room to act. And that revelation undermines decades of policy media portrayal and strategic control. There is also a lesson in strategic patience. These countries did not build this bank overnight. They endured hardship, sanctions, and diplomatic exclusion. They observed the failures of the old development model. They built alliances, raised regional capital, and consulted among themselves. What emerged was not a hasty rebellion, but a calculated, methodical alternative, one that places long-term planning over short-term gain. Moreover, the Confederate Bank teaches us about the importance of controlling financial tools. Currency systems like the CFA franc have long been used as instruments of economic dependency. By creating their own regional bank and preparing for an independent digital payment system, the AES nations are laying the foundation for a financial ecosystem that truly serves their interests. This step is essential in breaking the cycle of external manipulation, currency instability, and one-size-fits-all economic reforms. Yet the story is not just about rejecting the past, it is about building a future. The bank is developing not just infrastructure, but institutional capacity teams of economists, engineers, planners, and administrators who are shaping policy from within. It is creating local ownership, accountability, and confidence in African leadership. It is in short showing what happens when African solutions are applied to African challenges. One of the most striking elements of this transformation is that it is being led not by career politicians or technocrats from global think tanks, but by individuals who have lived through the consequences of dependency. This grounding gives them moral clarity and practical urgency. Their decisions are not made to impress donor agencies, they are made to improve lives. The final and perhaps most transformative lesson is, this sovereignty is not simply a political idea, it is a developmental strategy. When a country or region controls its own money projects and priorities, it gains the freedom to experiment, adapt, and grow in ways that are impossible under externally imposed systems. True development cannot be imported, it must be authored from within. In conclusion, the story of the Confederate Bank is a historic turning point, not only for the Sahel, but for Africa as a whole. It is a living example of how strategic cooperation grounded in shared purpose and informed by past injustices can produce new institutions capable of reshaping entire regions. It reminds us that dignity and direction are not gifts to be granted by others. They are responsibilities to be claimed by each nation for itself. The Sahel has done just that. And in doing so, it has taught the world that even the most overlooked countries can become architects of global change if they have the courage to believe in themselves. In the wake of the creation of the Confederate Bank for Investment and Development, people across Africa and beyond have voiced a wide range of powerful and emotional reactions. For many, this moment represents more than a financial shift. It's a symbol of long-awaited liberation. A woman from Dakar, Senegal, expressed that for decades, Africans have begged for support under humiliating conditions, but now, finally, they are choosing dignity over dependency. She described the bank not as a technical institution, but as a spiritual victory, a concrete form of continental pride. From Bamako, a young teacher noted how surprising it was that Mali, once perceived as a fragile state, is now part of something revolutionary. He confessed that this was the first time in his life he felt like his country was part of a greater mission, one led by Africans for Africans. This feeling was echoed by a farmer in Niger, who explained that development had always seemed like something decided in Paris. But now the conversation was happening in Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Bamako, and that alone gave him hope. In Ghana, several commentators highlighted how the Sahelian countries were doing what West Africa had only dreamed of for decades, turning Pan-African rhetoric into reality. One post read that while the rest of the continent is still entangled in bureaucratic unions and ineffective summits, these three nations were quietly building a functional independent system. People admired their courage, and many urged their own leaders to study the model seriously. There was also strong admiration from the diaspora. In Toronto, a political analyst called the bank's establishment one of the most geopolitically significant moments in African post-colonial history. He noted that this wasn't simply about avoiding IMF loans. It was about redefining Africa's place in the global economic system. He questioned why major international media had failed to cover such a monumental event. His frustration was shared by others in the West who recognized the potential implications of the bank's success. Not everyone was blindly optimistic, though. From London, a development expert raised concerns about transparency and governance. She said that while the idea of African sovereignty was appealing, the institutions needed strong internal safeguards, or risk repeating the same mistakes that Western-backed loans had inflicted. Still, she admitted that the silence from Western governments suggested discomfort, maybe even fear, at the idea of losing influence. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, one elderly man said he had lived long enough to see coups, poverty, and broken promises, but the formation of the Confederate Bank made him feel for the first time that his children might inherit a different future. In his view, this wasn't about political ideologies. It was about finally investing in people, not pleasing donors. His voice resonated with others who emphasized how the bank's early projects, solar energy for rural schools, food processing plants for farmers, and direct airline routes, were answering real practical needs. From Côte d'Ivoire, there was both admiration and shame. A university student wrote that she envied Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for having the courage to walk away from Western dependence. She expressed frustration that her country still waited for Paris's permission to act, while their neighbors were building banks and alliances on their own terms. In Nigeria, discussions focused on the regional implications. Many Nigerians expressed interest in joining the AES model, citing that Nigeria's size and economic power could complement the Sahel bloc's strategic vision. Others lamented how Nigeria's foreign policy remained stuck in outdated alliances and called on Abuja to adopt a bolder, more self-reliant approach. From Johannesburg, South African voices began to emerge as well. Some viewed the bank as an example of what real African integration could look like. A journalist wrote that the Sahelian Alliance was creating what the African Union had failed to build, a union based on mutual interest, shared sovereignty, and actual delivery of services, not just diplomatic conferences. Across social media, the idea of African-led development began trending. The phrase, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs space," was widely reposted and turned into a kind of digital slogan. Commenters from Nairobi, Algiers, and Kinshasa echoed that this moment felt different. For once, the change was not coming from pressure or protest, but from construction, from bricks, railways, solar panels, and policies. Even those unfamiliar with economics felt connected to the movement. A mother in a remote village in Mali posted that her children's school had power for the first time, thanks to the new solar grids. A young man in Burkina Faso shared photos of tomatoes being processed locally instead of being wasted or sold for pennies. A truck driver in Niger posted a video of a newly paved road connecting farming towns to major markets. These were not abstract developments. They were life-changing realities. What stood out in all these reactions was a deep emotional shift. The tone had changed from desperation to confidence. People were no longer asking what donors would give, but what Africans could build. The bank, in this sense, became more than a bank. It became a mirror reflecting a new identity. An identity rooted not in victimhood but in agency. Of course, some cautioned that it was still early days. A university professor in Kenya urged caution, warning that the enthusiasm must be matched with discipline, accountability, and long-term vision. But even he admitted that something irreversible had begun. The fact that the bank was created without noise, permission, or external validation was already proof of a new maturity in African governance. As the weeks passed, more and more people, from bloggers to scholars, market vendors to taxi drivers, began discussing the Confederate Bank, not as a miracle but as a model. Some asked when their own governments would dare to follow. Others debated whether a common African currency might be next. What was once unimaginable was now plausible. Above all, the strongest message across all these comments was unity. Not unity as a slogan, but as a working system. People saw, perhaps for the first time, that Africa could design something that didn't just resist the world, it redefined it. Not unity as a slogan, but as a working system. People saw perhaps for the first time that Africa could design something that didn't just resist the world, it redefined it.